Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending my little lecture. It's a pleasure to be here. Delighted to be invited back into the embrace of the West Virginia Humanities Council. I want to thank Eric Wagner for inviting me, the rest of the council. I want to thank Kyle Wormack for the logistics, handling the logistics of my visit. I want to thank my wife for supporting me and coming down and always giving me food for thought and directions to give the best presentation I can. I also want to acknowledge that for 6 years I was a citizen member of the council. I still have the portfolio that I was given some years ago, something that I treasure. One of the most gratifying periods of my life was serving with the council. So I'm really happy to be back here. My presentation really today is going to be on Black Huntington and the rise of the black middle class, primarily in Huntington, but it also speaks to the rise of the black middle class within the state itself. And I think it's important first to kind of give some context as to some really national historical developments that are taking place in this era. It's important to recognize that Huntington was founded in 1871, a mere 6 years after the end of the Civil War. And so in this pivotal era, there's a great deal of transition, turmoil that is impacting the country in significant and even profound ways. This is an era in which we have Reconstruction, in which the federal government steps forth and under the radical Republicans assist as best it can the aspirations for African Americans and to assist them in garnering the fullness of this newfound freedom and eventual citizenship. We also have, and by the way, Black Huntingtonians and Black West Virginians in large measure would not benefit from the Freedmen's Bureau because there wouldn't be one established in the state. We also have the Gilded Age. And this Gilded Age is a period of remarkable economic growth, much of it centered around the expansion of railroad construction that takes place as engines to develop regional economic progress. The CNO, Chesapeake Ohio Railroad, would be one of them. Of course, we've already had the establishment of the National Transcontinental Railroad, Central Pacific and Union Pacific. And so within this context, then, it is not, the development of the Chesapeake Ohio Railroad is just emblematic of what's taking place across the country with this massive railroad construction that takes place as engines of economic change. And certainly we'll get to that a little bit in my lecture. We also have the notion and the development of what I would call, and what historians have called, empire building process. You know, America has settled the sectional crisis, the Civil War, and is now embarking on establishing a republic and demarcating or defining what that is. And in the process of that, we're also going to expand out to the Pacific and to the Caribbean as we go about ensuring, at least in our understanding, of what this country will be. The whole notion of manifest destiny that has been a driver for recent history is now expanding out into the Pacific and extending out into the Caribbean. And so there's also an empire building process. And many peoples will be impacted negatively by this process. Native Americans, most especially. But we also have various other Chinese as well as European immigrants coming into this country. And it's a really paradoxical relationship because even African Americans are caught up in this empire building process. To what extent do they become embraced the whole notion of empire building and the separation of this racialized hierarchy that exists through social Darwinist theories that exist in this era and notions. And then, of course, in conjunction with the development of Huntington and the rise of Huntington would be the Great Migration, this massive movement of black Southerners south to north, south to the west, but also east to west. And that last development is the one we're going to be concerned about most significantly, because that's going to bring folks from Virginia into West Virginia and Central Appalachia. And so these four or five massive developments that are taking place, Huntington and black Huntingtonians are part and parcel of these dynamics, of these processes, of these fault lines and fissures. My program really starts off with, there's a gentleman in my book, Black Huntington, an Applachian Story, a gentleman by the name of Professor J.W. Scott. He wrote a pamphlet in 1911, and the title of the pamphlet is Progress of the Huntington Negro. And it's a really important pamphlet because it really encapsulates the whole notion of this, of not only the history that has impacted African Americans throughout the South, but also delineates the impediments that they face in moving forward to grasp the fullness of their freedom. We have gotten out of the cellar, so to speak, and that means much. Our eyes are beginning to open. The proverbial short-sightedness of the first Negro settlers who refused to buy real estate when land was cheap was a racial blunder from which we suffer today. Yet a few who brought their families or who married out here were wise enough to buy homes. And so Professor Scott, and by the way, there is a Scott Center still located within Huntington on 9th Avenue that I remember fondly as a community center. What is important about Professor Scott's observation, or at least notions, is that in essence, he's pinpointing black progress solely in terms of economic purchase of land. I'm going to try to complicate this whole notion of the only vehicle by which we can move forward is the acquisition of land. It's a fair assessment, but it's not the only way to view the progress of African Americans during this era. As I mentioned before, the catalyst for black migration into West Virginia, into Central Appalachia, is really the construction of the C&O Railroad through the New River Valley that connects Richmond to Huntington. Huntington is established as a transshipment point, as a western terminus for the Chesapeake Ohio Railroad, led by Collis P. Huntington. This massive project could be argued as being the most seminal event in the history of the state, because it opens up the coal fields, which allows West Virginia to become the nation's leading coal-producing state throughout the 20th century, much of the 20th century. It's going to also bring the cash wage labor system into the state, and it's going to attract massive numbers of African Americans and poor whites into the region, into working for the railroad. We know about the story of John Henry, who was one of those folks who got caught up in the battle with the technology, working through the Big Bend Tunnel. Well, John Henry was just one of thousands that came through and worked on the railroad. And what's going to happen is, as the railroad progresses through the New River Valley, and as you begin to have the development of towns, enclaves, in which black people will settle along the way, you then begin to have the settlement of black people into the region. And this would be the development of what we would call the black working class. And they're going to slowly but surely make their imprint upon the region. Certainly, I would argue that Huntington is going to be central as the western terminus for the C&O Railroad. Black people are going to increasingly come into the state and come into Huntington because of jobs, not necessarily because they're seeking to take advantage of the franchise. The primary driver for black people coming into the state is the fact that they can find gainful employment. I have a slide that, in essence, Ronald Lewis, Black Influx into Central Appalachian Coalfields, and it gives a map of black influx into the coalfield region in central and southern West Virginia, into southwestern Virginia, into eastern Kentucky, extending all the way down really into northeastern Tennessee. And this is part of this massive movement of blacks from the east into the west, the kind of intra-regional migration that takes place, as opposed to inter-regional migration that takes place. In his study of African Americans to West Virginia, historian Joe Trotter found that only about 21% of the state's blacks lived in southern counties in 1880. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad is finished in Huntington in 1873. So it's only natural that 7 years later there might not be that many blacks who have settled. They may be working on the railroad, but they haven't settled into the state as of yet. However, by 1910, the figure had climbed to 63%. So in conjunction with black migration into southern West Virginia, thousands of European immigrants are also settling into the region. And so significantly, southern West Virginia's population increased dramatically throughout the region from approximately 80,000 in 1880 to nearly 300,000 in 1910. The immigrant population from southern, central, and eastern Europe grew from 1,400 in 1880 to 18,000, 6% of the total, in 1910. African American growth outpaced foreign growth, expanding from 4,800 in 1880 to over 40,000, 14% of the total, in 1910. And so we see this massive influx. And they are assisting the development of the state. They are contributing significantly to the rise of Huntington. And this rise of the black working class, this first generation of workers, they are primarily unskilled and semi-skilled labor. They are in large measure blocked at the bottom socially, politically, and occupationally. But at least through the length of my study, growing occupational diversity and entrepreneurial options presents opportunity for African Americans migrating to the region to acquire income, move up the economic ladder, and create increasingly stable households. Now, there are going to be some fault lines and tensions with the increasing number of black folks, the Europeans, poor whites, all grappling for jobs within this new cash wage labor system. All of them are in large measure subject to the dictates and mandates of their employer. There are going to be some tensions. In 1880, 22 work stoppages were reported in West Virginia, placing the state 8th from the top in the ranking of all states. That same year, the leading cause of death will be railroad-related activities. One of the things my book also discusses is that even though there are examples of racial animosities and violence that takes place within Huntington between working class blacks and whites, none of it seems to be related to the workplace. That doesn't mean it didn't take place, that there were no abiding hostilities or violence between whites and blacks that existed in the workplace, but I don't have any evidence of it. There's also no evidence of black-initiated strikes or work actions against the employer. And mainly because I don't think blacks had the power to initiate any work actions or strikes that would be in any way impactful. There's also no evidence of black or interracial working class cooperation reform movements, which existed in the southern West Virginia coal fields, for instance, where black coal miner Richard L. Davis, as the head of the National Board of United Mine Workers, attempted to forge an interracial trade union movement with not much success, but at least there were attempts. In Huntington, I don't have any evidence of this attempt to have an interracial effort to address the challenges of being at the bottom of the wage labor system and their exploitation as workers. I think black people are generally much more interested in garnering wages, doing their jobs, dealing with the prevailing racial status quo, the prevailing occupational situation, and going back home and working on building up their families and stabilizing their economic situation, and then also using their efforts and money to build black institutions. It should be said that black women are also contributing to the household income in multiple ways, in many ways hidden from the public record. I have one instance in which the husband has started a small business, but he can't read the books. He doesn't understand the figures. His wife, who is literate, is able to actually keep the books for him. I have slides here in which the West Virginia population, basically I detail the increase in the African American population statewide from 1870 to 1930, and the increasing percentage of African Americans in the general population. I also detail the fact that Huntington population grew significantly. From 1870 to 1900, Huntington's population grows from 6,429 to 11,923. The Negro population grows from 123 people in Cabell County. Remember now, Huntington is not established until 1871, so when I say 1870, it really is about 6,429 people in the county. In the aftermath of the Civil War, essentially, black people leave. I believe there were 329 African Americans in the county, Cabell County, in 1860. Well, that number has dropped by more than half by 1870 as folks leave for various reasons. Many of them will return as jobs become available. So we have in 1870, 123 people. In 1880, 487 African Americans. By 1890, 1,231. About 1900, 1,212. A slight drop from the 1890 figure that I attribute to the Depression of 1893 that impacts everyone economically. But in any event, the important part here is that African Americans have come back, and that they have a larger percentage of the population in Huntington at roughly 10.2% in 1900. All of this is to give you some sense of that, in fact, this first generation of African Americans into the Huntington and into the state are contributing significantly through various endeavors to the rise of West Virginia as an economic powerhouse. Without the sacrifices and contributions, the persistence of African Americans in the first generation, you're not going to have a black middle class that will develop. We have the development of the black working class. Unquestionably, I would argue that the most important contribution that these first generation of black Huntingtonians make is the development of black institutions. First Baptist Church, 16th Street Baptist Church, AME Young Church, I believe. At this particular time, the church is the central location for the black community. There also would be developing the Douglas High School. Now, it should be said that as increasing numbers of black people come into the state, as increasing numbers of black people settle into the state, West Virginia embraces the policy of benevolent segregation. Which means essentially all West Virginia is not necessarily as invested in the strictures of segregation that exist in the Deep South. It's not embodying the same terrorist actions or impediments to black progress. It should be noted that there is a policy of this benevolent segregation that guides the statewide response to black people's aspirations. And this benevolent segregation policy coincides with the maturing of black institutions, the development of benevolent associations, increasing black political engagement, black entrance into the public space, and the embryonic rise of a black professional class. Now, this is what interested, one of the fascinating things about me is this paradoxical relationship that exists within West Virginia. Because in comparison to the Deep South, it is unquestionably more progressive. And black leaders are aware of it. They are out there recruiting in black newspapers within their visits to the various political or benevolent associations. Hey, look, you need to come here. You know, not only do you have a much more amenable racial climate, but we have the franchise. There's also opportunity here. And within these benevolent segregation policy, at least there is the development of black institutions in which black people, if they have the talent and expertise, can garner employment and perhaps even lead. But it's a fascinating thing that exists because this benevolent segregation is symptomatic of what's going on in the South, well, in the Kentucky, in urban areas as well. In Louisville, for instance, it was called polite racism. Whites control the racial environment through numerical superiority, which is the same thing that largely exists in West Virginia, and certainly that exists within Huntington. They control the public space. They control the policing and justice system. They control the local media and local and state politics. And when advantageous to them, they will provide selective backing of black interest. While state and city officials and urban industrial employers actively recruit African Americans here, touting the benefits of settlement, employment, and cordial race relations, the state's white residents sought ways to constrict black and working class occupational advancement and constrain black political aspiration. So we might not have had the threat of lynchings, but it should be understood that as we have a development of a black middle class, or the development of a black professional class who are literate and who are engaging, who are traveling to other black enclaves and traveling throughout the state and region, and learning about the nature of American society, they're not ignorant of or immune to the fact that this country is becoming more and more divided along racial lines. So there is a larger context to the development of a black middle class within Huntington. And I essentially say by the late 19th century, early 20th century, we have the development of a black middle class within Huntington and within the state. Regarding Huntington, by the early 1900s, Huntington is the epicenter of social, cultural, commercial, and economic activity, engagement, and interaction for blacks up and down the Ohio River Valley, for blacks up and down the New River Valley, for blacks up and down the Big Sandy and Tug Fork River Valley. And so this is a significant process because it leads to the cross-fertilization of state and regional populations. It should be said even local populations. So local, state, and regional populations. It leads to the cross-fertilization between rural and urban black populations as well. Increasingly, blacks from throughout the state and throughout the region are traveling to Huntington to engage in, just for the sheer joy of traveling, to shop, to engage in, to go to church visits, to engage in cakewalks, to attend fraternity meetings or benevolent society meetings, to go to the barbershops, to engage in professional associations, church associations, social clubs, high school activities and sports, a variety of cultural and recreational activities. And so within Black Huntington, there is a great deal to be said about this, the vibrancy and dynamism that exists within the Black community and its connections and connectivity to other Black communities in the regions that I spoke of. But I do want to make clear, the local newspapers daily, in large measure daily, are chronicling racial violence during the Jim Crow era that has taken place as the Black middle class develops. Black Huntingtonians are aware of it. And I just want to give you a listing of incidents of racial violence that takes place between 1877 and 1914. In 1885, there's the Rock Springs, Wyoming riot. In 1886, there's the Pittsburgh riot. In 1886, Seattle, Washington. In 1887, Denver. In 1887, again, there's a Hell's Canyon massacre. In 1887, there's a Thibodaux strike. In 1891, there's a New Orleans anti-Italian riot. In 1885, Tacoma, Washington. 1891, the first Omaha race riot. In Buffalo, New York in 1894. In 1894, the bituminous coal strike, miners' strike. 1895, New Orleans dock workers riot. Wilmington race riot in 1898. In 1898, Lake City, South Carolina. 1898, Greenwood County, South Carolina. 1899, Newburgh, New York riot. 1900, New Orleans, New York City. 1902, New York City. 1906, Little Rock, Arkansas. Atlanta. 1907, Bellingham riots in Washington. 1908, Springfield, Illinois. 1909, Greektown riot. 1910, nationwide riots following the heavyweight championship between Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries. In Slocum, Texas, there's the Slocum Massacre in 1910. And, that's just to kind of give you an overview of the backdrop in which African Americans and Black Huntingtonians are exposed to. These incidents are discussed unquestionably amongst leadership positions within the Black community in Huntington. One of the things we do need to also understand that it's not just about the fact that the specter of racial violence is ever present, as articulated and recounted by the local newspapers. It should be said that there are also evidence to say that there was a racialized discriminatory practice that existed within West Virginia. In 1900, for instance, the Black prison population in Illinois in 1900, the Black population comprised 8.1% of the total population, whereas it comprised 18.1% of its prison population. In West Virginia, the Black population comprises 4.7% of the total population, but it comprises 53% of the prison population. Most of those folks who are imprisoned are from the southern part of the state. We also have the presence of lynching that takes place in West Virginia. Numerically, while low, for instance, between 1882 and 1968, West Virginia whites, 20 of them were lynched, 28 blacks were lynched, for a total of 48 total. But if you consider the population of the state at that time, proportionally, the lynchings were high. So, given this backdrop, given the reality of the racialized environment in which African Americans exist, how do they grapple with this, and what are the strategies or tactics or efforts that they implement and philosophies that they embrace? The primary vehicle by which African Americans' philosophy that they embrace is racial uplift. By the as I stated earlier, by the late 1900s, early 20th century, you have a development of an embryonic black professional class, teachers, doctors, accountants, in some cases lawyers, who are literate and who are part of the vanguard of black professionals who are challenging the racial status quo and implementing policies and tactics to move the race forward. Certainly, Douglas High School is at the forefront, arguably at the forefront of the development of this movement. It is here that you're training, you're educating and training blacks to become leaders within the community, within the nation. We know about Carter G. Woodson as one example, but I'll talk about him and talk about some others as well. As part of this black professional class, the importance of it, and the black middle class. Whereas the working class, black working class, essentially provided the foundation, kind of tilled the soil, planted the crops. The black middle class is going to be there to harvest the crop that develops from those initial efforts. There's a growing assertiveness that is articulated by this class. There's increasing cultural maturation, and there is increasing racial solidarity. Now, in many instances, this is across class lines. That doesn't mean that there aren't some class fissures that exist within the black circumstance, and certainly within Black Huntington. One of the reasons for not having a working class movement was because, in large essence, I don't think there was an alignment between the black working class and the black middle class that allowed them to coalesce their energies and to attack their occupational challenges in a concerted effort. But we have the development of a black professional class, and we have the maturation of black institutions. We have the creation of the Barnett Hospital and the nursing school by Dr. Constantine C. Barnett and Clara Barnett, his wife. And Dr. C.C. Barnett was part of this black hospital movement that existed. His hospital, the building still exists on 7th Avenue. His hospital was was 6 out of 202 black hospitals that provided internships to black medical students. Graduates became respected surgeons at Tuskegee Institute and in Boston. He also provided surgical clinics. The nursing school, which will be affiliated and charged and led by his wife, Clara Barnett, would be accredited by the National Medical Association, an honor rarely accorded African-American nursing schools for the era. His sister, Josephine, it should be said that these are the sons and daughters of one of the earliest migrants into Huntington, Reverend Barnett. Josephine Barnett would be would have a 40-year career as a teacher at Douglas High. There would also be one of the more illustrious graduates of Douglas High School would be a lady by the name of Ravella Hughes. She was known popularly as Carmela Douche, or Douche, excuse me. She achieved international fame as a singer, musician, and performer. And importantly, she was nurtured. Not only was she personally nurtured, but her artistic talent was nurtured in the female-centric networks that existed in this era. There was an expectation that women of talent would actualize that talent, but also come back and give back to the community. And she will return home to Douglas, back to Huntington and back to Douglas High School, where she was initially trained and schooled, and become the music teacher for Douglas for a number of years. Folks also know about, and should know about, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who was a teacher and principal of Douglas High School after C.H. Barnett and J.W. Scott Carter G. Woodson was the first African-American of slave parentage to garner a PhD at Harvard. He is a world-renowned, internationally renowned historian, publisher of more than a dozen books, the father of Black History Month, co-founder of the largest scholarly association for African Americans called the Association of the Study of Life and History, and it is the largest association dedicated to Black history, life, and scholarship. Unquestionably, we should continue to recognize Carter G. Woodson's relevance to African American history, but also the fact that he is, in large measure, a Huntingtonian. It's important to recognize that. One of the interesting developments, I would say, of this era is the recognition, as part of this umbrella notion and philosophical belief and strategy of racial uplift, would be the development of a colored orphans home and industrial school that existed within Huntington. The colored orphans home could not have existed, I would argue, during the working class, during the first generation of Black Huntingtonians. There would not have been enough capital and political sway to facilitate such an endeavor. The colored orphans home, to me, is the embodiment of the Black community recognizing that the fault lines, that the children are, these orphans, are in large measure the fault lines of prevailing structural impediments. People falling through the cracks of this new cash wage labor system, or dying prematurely and working in the factories or on a railroad, whatever the case may be. And so it's an effort to really recognize that we have a responsibility to these orphans, to reach them, to support them, to train them so they can become productive citizens within America. Certainly it is part of another West Virginian, Booker T. Washington's notion of the Tuskegee Institute, give folks occupational industrial training, give them the skills, and they can then become full-fledged citizens and earn their way. And so, in essence, then, part of their whole racialized process is that, the racial uplift process, is that Black people are helping their own as best they can in multiple arenas. When I began this lecture, I talked about Professor J.W. Scott and his admonition to African Americans at that time for not purchasing property. Well, by the time we get around to 1924, increasing numbers of Black Huntingtonians have purchased property. By 1924, 60% of Black Huntingtonians own their homes, a figure higher than either the Black residents of Clarksburg, 54.7%, or Charleston at 45.8%. The aggregate worth of Black real estate holdings was approximately $1,400,000, a significant increase from the roughly $400,000 total worth cited by Professor Scott a decade earlier. And so this gives evidence of upward mobility, of stable homes. In 1926, Georgeschuler, a renowned reporter for the Pittsburgh Courier, as well as a novelist, stated that, as visiting the state, he said, "The relations between whites and Negroes are very cordial, and Negro business can always count upon the patronage of whites in West Virginia, no matter how strong the spirit of the Ku Klux Klan may be otherwise." Even though the presence of racial violence is there, Black people are moving forward. And it should be said that, in large measure, when you talk about the patronage of whites in West Virginia, there is an abiding, temperate racial environment that exists, cordial racial environment that exists. I'm going to finish up with my talk essentially by talking about the really important decision that was made in the case of, in 1929, in White versus White. A very ironic name for this case, considering that the Black people who are suing are named whites, suing white people who are named whites. A Black couple by the name of Whites are essentially suing to live where they want to live within the city of Huntington. At this time, racial covenants exist, which restricting them from moving to that neighborhood. With the assistance of the local NAACP as well as the state NAACP, they file suit. At the local level, that suit is decided against. They appeal to the state level. Eventually, with the help of the local and the interclass nature of the NAACP at this time, they prevail. And this case essentially, as one historian has called it, the most significant case striking down restrictive covenants since the Louisville segregation case of 1917, essentially a decade earlier, allows for black people throughout the state to have a legal standing to live where they want to live. This case is initiated by black Huntingtonians. It is initiated with the assistance of the black middle class leaders at this time who have garnered their expertise to move the case forward within a legal setting. That, to me, would have been very difficult to do during the first generation of the working class environment and population within Huntington. So in any event, I will end my lecture here by stating that this is, by the time we get to 1930, which is essentially where my book ends, African Americans, black Huntingtonians, have helped make Huntington the state's most populous city of 75,752. It has the state's second largest African American population of 4,630. And remember now, this city is formed in 1873. The rise of black middle class in Huntington and throughout the state reveals the complexity and dynamism of human agency amidst the social, political, and economic constraints that attempted to limit them. And unquestionably did limit them to some extent. But while West Virginia was progressive, certainly in comparison to the Deep South, the contagion of racism did infect social relations, political engagement, and occupational mobility. The fact that the black Huntingtonians and black West Virginians did not let that impede them is a testament to their persistence and their bravery and their strength. And so thus, while many black Huntingtonians and by extension black West Virginians were constrained by Jim Crowism, especially at the municipal level, the remarkable progress made by black middle class attests to their embodying strength, courage, and persistence to achieve the full measure of their efforts, aspirations, and citizenship. Thank you. Black female-centric networks, even from Huntington, their high school education, their college education would be ensconced within the support system of black female-centric networks to guide them, to provide guardrails, to ensure their safety and security, and to give them support, financial as well as social cultural support as they pursued their aspirations. I think it's more about the recognition that black women can assist black women move up and acquire their aspirations much more readily than men could. So as part of this, the burden, the responsibility that black women take at this time. As far as I know, in large measure, black women are not necessarily working with they're working in separate orbits to move the black race forward. And so when you talk about the black female-centric networks, they're working in conjunction with black men. They're just working in a different arena. An arena that is much more, natural for them at this time. No one's talked about it sufficiently, I guess. I mean, there have been books that talks about the black presence in the coal fields. It's just they've been few and far between. Ron Lewis wrote an important article. Joe Trotter did a study. But those are, they're pretty old. I can't think of a recent study that addresses the presence, black presence in the coal mines, coal fields, in a really significant fashion. I know that, if we could look at the aggregate, I think there are definitely some robust, important studies that have been out there. I just can't think of anything within the past decade that has examined that. I think part of the reason might be the dying of sources, the dearth of source material, new source material. It's important that I articulate that if I hadn't done my study when I did, I don't think it could have been done. People are dying off. When they die, their source material leaves with them in many cases, is thrown in a dumper or whatever the case may be. And so the ability to access those and to use them is lost. And I think as you have these small, these enclaves along the C&O Railroad, these black enclaves and long-standing families that had existed, in the changing economic situation, folks had to leave. You lose a lot, I think. And so there may just be a real serious lack of source material to re-engage it in a really earnest way. Part of my research took me to Clifton Forge, where I met with an African-American male whose family had been in Clifton Forge for a long time. And it was very helpful to me. And he was not only helpful to me in giving me material to use for the book, but he let me sleep on his couch for 2 nights gratis. And so, how often do researchers have that opportunity to connect with someone from the town who has deep roots in a particular town, and who is willing and able to assist you? That's a real problem in researching black people within the state and Central Appalachia. It's a real challenge. Incredibly helpful. Yeah. And that was part of the reason why I went to Clifton Forge, was, the primary reason was to go to CNO archives. But I just so happened that this gentleman's daughter was a friend of my sister at that time, and my sisters told the daughter that this is what my plans were. She reached out to the father, and he said, yeah, if he comes this way, he can stay with us. These are the small serendipitous developments that assist you in accomplishing the goal. This whole notion of success, how do you define that? Certainly, Beckley, Bluefield, McDowell County. McDowell County especially has, and Charleston has a significant number of there is an abiding, robust black middle class that is able to impact the local politics and state politics, I think, in important ways. In large measure, Huntington is not there. And in fact, Georgeschuler kind of talks about that black Huntingtonians are a little bit less progressive than black Charlestonians, for instance, a little bit less active in challenging the status quo than black Charlestonians. And I've always heard that refrain from even contemporaries who grew up, my father's generation, let's say, that Huntington has always been a little bit parochial. I would contend that black Huntingtonians never had sufficient numerical presence to impact the local politics in a significant way. If you're 7.1% of the population, or even 10.1 or 12.1, like it was in 1890, you may be able to make some inroads into some municipal positions, but you're not going to, at this time, you're not going to make significant inroads into positions of power. It's just not going to happen. And so, you may get a position as the head of sanitation services or something to that effect. And that's not to knock sanitation services. I mean, it's a good wage. You've got some authority, but that position is not going to lend itself to impacting the day-to-day politics of the city. And I think that black people realize that, and so that's why they shifted over to let's build up black institutions. Let's build up the black church. Let's build up the black schools. Let's fortify our families, fortify spiritually, culturally, educationally, if at all possible financially. We'll fortify them in that way so that we can bypass the political impediments that exist within the city and the state. But two, of course, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad bringing jobs. But the second one would be that there had already been a resident black population across the river in Burlington, Ohio. It was small, but there was, along Ohio, Burlington, Chesapeake, South Point, even down, extending down to Ironton. There's a resident black population, so at least, again, it's about that cross-fertilization. You have all these other attributes, all these other opportunities for engagement, for free engagement. I mean, it's not like you have to worry about the specter of the KKK running up on your yard and throwing down a torch. And so for black people, this sense of communion, soul food, you've got the soul food, literal soul food and eating, but there's also soul food and people coming together, celebrating their newfound freedom, celebrating their newfound success, the fruit of their labor, so to speak. And so for black people coming together, they're not so worried about, we're living within a segregated society. Well, who cares? We know it's out there. We know the violence is out there, but as long as we're able to still commune, fellowship, engage, strategize, educate our children, provide them a safe haven and a sense of security, I think those are the primary aspirations. And that's how they're going to define their success. It's the domestic arena, it's the social cultural arena that I think is the primary goals, not necessarily getting political, garnering political positions. I don't think that's necessarily the primary objective. I mean, at a point in time, I think the CNO has 5,000 black laborers as it's building its way through the New River Valley. I mean, that's a significant presence. At a point, Huntington had 1,000 black laborers within the general vicinity working on the CNO Railroad, and so they're working their heinies off. They're working hard. They're doing the most backbreaking, arduous, dangerous work, bit by bit, inch by inch, rung by rung. They're moving up. The black church, I think, is the nexus by which the black community is coming to kind of assist each other, as black churches have always done. Cookouts, socials, whatever the case may be, and you position yourself so that your children will have better lives than you. The cakewalk was essentially a black celebratory event that asserted black people's rights to occupy the public space. In an era of segregation, in an era in which you are supposedly confined to how much public space you can actually occupy and utilize. Cakewalks, at least in one instance, there's a cakewalk that takes place in which black residents from Ironton, I believe Ashland, Burlington, as well as Huntington gather. It's supposed to be 5,000 people is what the newspaper reports. 5,000 people coming together to engage in this cakewalk exhibition competition, and they do it in the middle of Huntington. And so, to me, that may not. I think we need to understand that that is an overtly political action at a time in which you are supposedly not allowed to occupy this public space in the way that you choose. And in fact, you know, you've got segregated parks that you're supposed to stay in. You know, you're supposed to observe these unwritten rules of public engagement when you encounter white people. And so by having a cakewalk from multiple black enclaves of people gathering in Huntington, that to me is an explicitly political action to say that we're going to assert our right to this public space, and you better recognize.
And why was it called a cakewalk?
It's a competition. You're judged by how you dress. You're judged by how well you dance. It's not something one took lightly if you entered. The victor would get the cake as a prize. You know, the cake might not have actually been a cake, but, you know, it could have been a metaphor for some other, prize at the end. There is an endeavor underway to establish a TriState African-American Cultural Center in Huntington. I was approached to be a part of this endeavor. COVID put a real, stalled the momentum of it. This is endeavor, I don't know if folks know or not, but there is, Huntington won a Choice Neighborhood Award, was a few years back. And in that process garnered, I think a couple of $1 million. I can't remember exactly, I wasn't there, but I'm somewhat aware of it. And in part of this money, received from the federal government for this award as a choice neighborhood, part of the money was designated to revitalize Fairfield West community, which is where I grew up, and arguably one of the worst sections of Huntington currently. There is a movement afoot to revitalize it, and there are monies that have been given out to assist in that endeavor. Marshall University is leading it, Cabell Huntington Hospital, and the city is involved in this process. And the hope would be to build new housing, to improve the infrastructure, to revitalize part of 80 Lewis, and to better, to elevate the historical presence and significance of Fairfield West. And the TriState African-American Heritage Center, or Cultural Center, would be the primary museum, community center, educational institution, and it would hopefully be a place where we would recognize the significance of Carter G. Woodson, primarily. Also, Macedonia Church, which is the mother church of black churches within the tri-state region, which is up above Burlington, will be relocated down to the Heritage Center. And so this will be the epicenter of black cultural revitalization within the city. We hope to have it off the ground by 2026, which would be the 100th anniversary of creation of Black History, Negro History Week, which would become Black History Month. We're working through that process. I'm optimistic. If there ever was a time that we can get this off the ground, I would think now would be the time. So if anyone out there is interested and wants to contact primarily the city of Huntington, Steve Williams' office, Mayor Steve Williams, and asked what's the process, what's the progress of that, and or Marshall University or Cabell Huntington Hospital. I believe it's Dr. Jerome Gilbert of Marshall, Dr. Kevin Yingley of Cabell Huntington, and Mayor Steve Williams are the three main cogs in this process.